You're listening to the Place Northwest podcast, your digital resource for the latest insight and analysis on all things property in the northwest of England. Listen when you want, where you want.
Hello and welcome to today's Place Northwest podcast. I'm your host, Dan Whelan. This podcast is brought to you in association with Lancashire-based construction firm Hargreaves Contracting. Hargreaves works across a range of sectors including commercial, industrial, residential and health and leisure. The company has recently secured large industrial contracts for clients including Salford Van Hire, Hologic and Liberty Properties. If you'd like to find out more about Hargreaves, you can do so by visiting www.hargreavescontracting.com. Today I am joined by two guests who are going to talk to me about the problems currently facing the construction industry. My guests are Stuart Stead, Head of Property and Construction at accountancy firm Cowgills, and Ben Fearns, Managing Director of developer Novo Property Group. Since 2018, Bardsley, Poaching, Forest, Marcus Worthington and Company, Harry Fairclough, CP UK, Cruden and most recently Goodwins, among others, it must be said, have all entered administration. What are the main problems facing the construction industry currently, Ben?
Sure. Very, very difficult question to answer. But if I was to pinpoint areas, I would say liquidity, contractual liability and exposure. And I think for the market to balance those, particularly through the difficulties that we're going through this year, it's incredibly difficult. I think COVID acts as exposing any of your underlying weaknesses, both in a human sense and also from a commercial sense. And the jobs of the sorts of contractors that you've mentioned, they as well as a construction vehicle, they're also a financial conduit. They're a conduit between an employer, trades, and suppliers. And within that chain, I'm guessing something like 80% of the finance that passes through their doors goes straight back out again, which does not leave any room at all for contractual weaknesses, for things which have been missed. It's an incredible difficult business to turn a margin and do that over a sustained period.
Thank you very much. Stuart, I'll come to you. As I mentioned, this year alone, we've seen a number of firms collapse. Drawing on Ben's points just now, what do you put that down to, and which of the problems do you think is the most damaging?
Right, I think it's very hard to generalise on kind of specific construction companies, really. Just from what I can kind of glean out of the marketplace, and COVID's been a factor clearly in relation to, as Ben says, kind of contractual problems, delays. Brexit isn't, the full extent of that hasn't quite hit us yet in terms of supply problems, price increases, etc. But in terms of the ones that have collapsed, it's what I've seen from my own kind of experience on the speaking to clients and wider people in the sector. It's very much about taking on work that particular company hasn't necessarily got the specific expertise to do. Construction is very, very complicated, which means by definition you need to carry a lot of resource. When you're in a situation where the economy is in the position that it's in, that ability to pick and choose work isn't really there, perhaps as it has been in the past, and that's a real problem. But I think has happened as well, and again, this is not in relation to the specific companies we've mentioned, but perhaps COVID has exposed some inherent weaknesses in certain businesses, and the COVID situation can, in certain circumstances, enable bad news to be buried. And I'm not saying again that's the case in these particular situations, but it is a consideration. And for me, it does point to risk. Back to the point which I'm sure we'll cover shortly regarding design and build contracts and that perceived kind of disproportionate passing of risk onto the contractor.
Yeah, absolutely. And you mentioned design and build there, and yeah, we will come on to that very shortly. I just want to read you a tweet from Artes, which obviously is another construction firm, in response to the news that Goodwin's had entered administration. It says, let me guess, a mixture of rapid growth and lots of unfair D&B contracts. Didn't know them well, but seemed like a nice bunch of guys. The industry needs to wake up quickly. And I guess that comes back to two of your points, Stuart, about design and build and risk. Lots of unfair D&B contracts. Ben, could you just explain to the listeners what a D&B contract is, and why a developer or employer would use this route?
Sure. Well, I'm not a construction lawyer, but I have used D&B contracts a number of times. D&B seems to mean something different to everybody that's been in contract with it. It's designed for an employer to enter into contract with a main contractor without having a fully detailed design. The idea of that is that it allows the employer certainty and the contractor the ability to generate further gains through the design development stages. So in essence, your employer has a brief. There's a certain amount of information that comes with that brief, and it's the contractor's specialism and responsibility to deliver it. And interesting point that Stuart picked on was the contractor's willingness to take risk within that. So they're taking a known gamble, and I think the problem with D&B comes down to the balance of that risk. That's both the employer's willingness to enter into a contract without having something fully designed, and the contractor's willingness to understand that it is substantially liable should it have missed something. And in my view, without cutting too much to the chase, that risk reward balance isn't sufficient for the risks that the contractors are taking.
The sponsor of today's podcast, Hargreaves Contracting, mentioned to me in conversations we had prior to recording this podcast that design and build contracts make up a large proportion of its work, and that it's the imbalance of risk between contractor and employer that is the most concerning aspect. Stuart, could you tell us a little bit more about that, please?
Well, from what I've seen, yes, and from my kind of rudimentary understanding of D&B really is that I think the standard form contract is reasonably balanced between employer and contractor, but because the vast majority of contracts that are asking to be tendered or negotiated are D&B, it's very much the industry norm these days. Then a lot of construction companies just have no choice but to take on that risk because everything is being sent out on that basis. Now, what tends to happen from my own experience is once a contractor is in they've under contract, they're in the final stages of negotiation, then the employer's agents or the employer's consultants do tend to try and push more of the risk onto the contractor after the initial balance of risk has been agreed. The contractor is obviously in a situation where it's got overheads and profits that it needs to get some contribution to. So they end up really falling foul of kind of commercial forces and just running with this, passing the risk onto them. In a hope that risk doesn't manifest itself later, or they can find a way to get kind of financially compensated for that risk. If that doesn't happen, then clearly there's a huge number of problems, really.
Can I jump in on that point, which just about the balance of risk? I think it's inherent. I think the risk reward within property is usually something which is very quantifiable, and the lower the reward, the lower the risk, the lower the reward, the higher the risk, the greater money that's made.
Yeah.
But what I would say is the problem that I've seen with D&B is that it's the contractual nature between the parties, which is that you're at odds with each other. So on a journey that is building something out, starting from scratch and creating homes or offices or whatever it is, then it's a long journey that team needs to be collectively working together to deliver. Whereas with D&B, its primary basis is to allow the two parties to push and pull so the employer wants it as cheap as possible, and the contractor wants to create as much margin as possible. And what that's ultimately doing is either pushing for contractual dispute, or it's pushing for the cheapest possible product. And the net result is a worse product for the end user, and a bumpy road for each party.
Yeah, absolutely. And so I've certainly seen through experience with our clients, Ben, is that I understand that point absolutely. But what I do see is clauses ending up in contracts in relation to damages specifically that are just that they're so large and penal, clearly because of the designs and needs of the employer, absolutely. But they are setting at such a level that you could never ever pay them, even if they came to fruition. So I think from there has to be a realism here that you can only essentially pay out the profit that's in the margin that's in the job for the contractor. Now currently that isn't covered for in legislation, but maybe that is something that should be considered to cap the liability for the contractor, because all that happens is they can't pay it, they go down, and then the employer's in a situation where the cost to try and salvage the project is even greater.
Absolutely. And I guess this might come across as quite a simple question, but if there's such a risk involved in undertaking D&B contracts, why do construction firms do it?
Because a lot of them are actually going into the market on that basis. So if you're a construction business at the moment, you don't have the stats to hand or they're available at all. But I would suspect that the vast majority of contracts are being procured on a D&B basis at either the behest of the employer or their advisors.
Yeah, I can say as an employer on multiple projects, working with multiple different employers agents, I can, in every single instance, we've been advised to go down a design and build contract. So in terms of why there is a market there, it's that route that D&B has almost become the generic contract form. And so if you look at the very early stages of a project, if the employer is getting advised to go down that road, that's where it will start.
Is the onus not on employers and developers to recognise the problems surrounding design and build and find an alternative solution that can safeguard construction companies?
Very much so. I think developers or employers going into a contract should be looking to progress the design, to be closer to construction, to be not looking to see design and build as ultimately effectively another type of insurance product to deliver the project.
Okay, and Stuart, what in your opinion can be done to rebalance the risk?
Yeah, I think when you look at a D&B contract, we're not just looking at a property developer as being the employer here. So it may be it's a manufacturing business who wants to build a new facility. So that they're not property people, they're not construction people. So they are going to very much rely upon their consultants to advise the best way forward with the project. So I think there's for me there's an obligation really with the professional consultant sector just to say, listen, I know that on paper it makes sense to pass this risk down the chain, but that can really be counterproductive, as I think we've seen. And my fear is there's going to be nobody left. There's going to be no medium-sized contractors left out there if we're not careful. So I think there has to be a realisation that it needs to change, and this is about kind of education, both from a consultant endpoint, and I think the contractors got the role to play as well. I think maybe part of the reason historically why there's been a desire to pass more risk on to the contractors, because contractors not always necessarily dealt in good faith. I'm not saying that's the case across the piece, but there's always been a nervousness on this almost adversarial kind of approach between employer and contractor, and I think unless that is culturally aligned, go back to Ben's point before, then we're always going to have this problem for me. So I think it's very much, go back to Ben's point about collaboration, kind of building partnerships, really.
Okay. And Ben, coming back to you, CP UK was the contractor on one of Novo's schemes on Brown Street in Hale. Obviously, CP UK collapsed earlier this year, and you, in order to sort of rectify that issue, you went about it in a unique kind of way, I think. Could you explain what that experience was like and how you dealt with it?
Yeah, well, ironically, what we find ourselves with CPUK was actually a collaborative partnership with good culture. So it was very much hoping that was a long-term relationship. That some of the recommendations that Stuart was just setting out there was hopefully already in place within between us. But yeah, with CPUK on Brown Street, that was the second contract that we were doing together, and yes, it was a design and build contract. We were only 30% of the way through the build at the point at which they got into difficulty, and it all happened very, very quickly because this was March, April time earlier this year. So this was the first that as a country we were getting to grips with COVID. Sites were stalled or stopping, which just turned off the taps from a cash flow perspective to CPUK. So if they were in financial difficulty coming into the year, then COVID just didn't allow them any time to recover. So we were faced with a position that we had, to put in context, we were out the ground, we had a partially erected steel frame, and we were probably 20-30% of the way through our procurement, but we were in a market which was very turbulent, and the thought process wasn't necessarily to go straight from one design build contract into another, and I think that's proven interesting that that of the potential tender list for us to have sought a new contractor, one of those companies have since gone into administration. So the route that we took was to, we had a great relationship with CPUK. The culture of the team integration was perfect. So the natural step for us was to take on some of their staff and to adapt and view the rest of the project on a self-delivery basis, which brings with it doesn't allow us to have theoretically imparted the risk onto another party, but allows us to deal with everything directly, which we are now in the latter stages of that scheme. So I can say so far it's been a massive success.
And is that something you're planning to do going forward?
Absolutely. We've continued to take further team members on to grow the effectively the self-delivery arm of the business. So next year we'll be running around 10 million through the the construction operation, and it's bringing with it a host of challenges. I didn't think I'd be sat in meetings negotiating accounts with brickies and dealing with problems with our joinery package. But what's refreshing is to hear what the actual issue is on site, as opposed to the contractual position that would usually come back through.
Excellent. And design and build is a contributing factor to the collapse of companies, but there's more to it than that. Stuart, could you tell us a little bit more about the other underlying problems that construction companies are facing, and what they can do to protect themselves?
I think construction is a very complicated sector, and it's fraught with unknowns. And what I tend to see in my experience is a lot of construction companies are undercapitalised, so they don't have sufficient cash and working capital available to be able to stand any significant issues or delays. As the business grows in the sector, they take on more and more contracts and more potential ways in which there can be delays and problems. What we often see is contract A might be performing very well. Now that then subsidises contract B, which maybe isn't doing quite so great. Contract A then has a problem, and all of a sudden the wheels kind of come to a halt. Um, what what is currently a big no from an employee's perspective is um, running contracts by individual kind of SPV companies, as we call them. So, but I actually think ring fencing contractual risk for a particular scheme is a sensible thing to consider. What often happens is this kind of cross contamination of contracts causes real problems. So, if that can be avoided, I think that would be useful. Generally, I think there's still a underlying kind of cultural problem in the construction. I think it's generational for me, and this potentially adversarial standpoint, as I mentioned before, is just still prevalent, and it's all about can I maximise the position on the contract at the employer's expense and vice versa. So I think until the two parties really start to collaborate more closely, I think you're always going to get that kind of lock in the phones.
Yeah, absolutely. Ben, do you have anything to add on that?
I could really relate to Stuart's comment about SPVs because developers use them so regularly. And I think the interesting thing there is that the contractor will be presenting their main vehicle. They're likely one of a handful within the group, but the employer will be very commonly working from an SPV, which allows it to ring fence its financing, ring fence its liability, and give a very clear indication as to the health of that project. From a contractor's perspective, as Stuart was alluding to, there is a rolled up position across multiple contracts, some going well, some going badly. And that was something that we were seeing was ultimately the pound that we're paying out isn't necessarily going to pay for what's been certified on site. It would be going out to whoever within the supply chain is shouting loudest. So I think a substantial improvement could be that firstly contractors demonstrate that they have the working capital for that project, and how that can be ring fenced throughout the life of the project to ensure that it's sufficiently cash flowed. I know that in our experience working with CPUK, that our project was financially viable for them. It was paid on time throughout, but ultimately other contracts weren't as successful. And so why should we as employer on that project, or the subcontractors working on that site for that matter, suffer because of other issues.
Absolutely, and I think what often gets forgotten is the fact that at the end of the day, there's people losing jobs as a result of this, these ongoing problems, and that's obviously a massive negative. We've mentioned needing a culture shift. Feels to me that we're at a turning point, really, or should be at a turning point where that culture shift comes into force. How can we encourage contractors and employers to work together more collaboratively? We know that in life and business and property, more specifically, collaboration works, and often the end result is better for that collaboration. So what can be done between employers and contractors to do away with that adversarial ethos that you mentioned, Stuart, and bring forward a more harmonious working relationship?
I think it is happening in pockets, Dan. There are examples of this happening. I think for me, it's you have to create alignment in terms of the objectives, and I think if you get you look at a relationship in the long term, then if you can get your head around looking at it in this way, then maybe on contract one you don't get quite what you wanted, but on contract two you can then maybe call a little back, and the employer and the contractor working together to just to make sure that over their, I suppose, careers and kind of lifespan together in construction, that they're building this as this long term kind of understanding and rapport. I think that gets hampered very, very much by a short term view. So I think the incentive or the mandate for the employer, if that wasn't so much, well, I need to get the figures up for this financial year and or keep this cost down, then I think it would foster a longer term view. And I think very much from the contractor's perspective, the same. If you look at things more kind of medium to long term rather than short term, you can invest time and money in the relationship. You can maybe convince the employer to enter into kind of pre-construction services agreements, which means you can spend more time pricing up the job, getting the design right, just making sure that before you put a spade in the ground that you've done as much homework as you possibly can do to mitigate that risk. And I'm a big believer of kind of open book stuff as well. So if you've put a tender in and saying that overheads and profits are X%, then if that's the case, then why wouldn't you want to share that information? So I think it's very much about fostering relationships, getting greater transparency, but aligning the financial benefits between the employer and the contractor. Otherwise, you're just going to get employer wants it as cheap as he can, and contractor is going to have to try and find ways to claw back some margin.
Ben, any thoughts from you finally on what can be done to foster this positive change?
I think there's been a generational shift in in the whole commercial market. I think there's been a rise of a new breed of developer, which I would fit into. But I think, and likewise, a new breed of contractor that some of the older contractors have had to compete with, and that is where there is accelerated as opposed to organic growth. And I think that there needs to be much more control within that process, much more consideration. As Stuart was saying before, a cultural shift towards transparency as opposed to trying to hide margin. I think there needs to be better consideration for the long-term growth of construction companies built with firmer balance sheets, as Stuart said before. So I would be agreeing with Stuart in terms of looking at pre-contract agreements, and I would be looking at more transparent contractual measures. So I'd be suggesting either management contracts on an open book basis. conduit that I spoke of before, where the contractor is processing so much finance that it's ultimately it becomes liable for, but not necessarily should be liable for. It allows for a much fairer and more open process, and in turn, an open disclosure about what is being made. And I think it's just all about how that starting process. There's enough information got into the contract. There's enough financial stability within with the contractor to see that project through.
Absolutely, and as you mentioned before, COVID has accelerated a lot of changes that were already in train prior to the pandemic, and let's hope in 2021 we can see some of these changes that you've both mentioned there come into force for the sake of the construction industry, really. That's all we've got time for today on this Place Northwest podcast. Thanks again to my guests, Stuart Stead and Ben Fearns, and thank you for listening. This podcast was brought to you in association with Hargreaves Contracting. As I mentioned at the top of the show, Hargreaves Contracting works across a number of sectors, including residential. Recently, the company secured contracts to deliver 100 homes across 3 sites in the Northwest for Southway Housing Trust and Great Places Housing Group. A high proportion of Hargreaves' work is carried out on a repeat basis, underpinned by client confidence and loyalty. If you would like to find out more about Hargreaves, you can do so by visiting www.hargreavescontracting.com. Thanks again for listening.